Even to this day, it seems incredible to think of how much time I really spent locked in that basement, though I wouldn't find out exactly how long it was until after the ordeal was over. I knew even while it was happening that it was years. As it turned out, it was a little more than 10 years I spent down there, growing from a teenager into an adult, while a cold steel manacle was clasped around my ankle. I was kidnapped just before my 13th birthday. It happened at night, while I was walking home from basketball practice. It was a clear night, and I had felt that the light from the full moon above me was more than adequate to drive away the fears I normally had while walking in the dark. Of course, I didn't really know what fear was then. Not yet. As I hummed a tune that I had heard on the radio the previous afternoon, I kicked the occasional rock and glanced up from the ground in front of me only every a few seconds to ensure that I was still aiming in the right direction. I hadn't bothered to change my basketball uniform, knowing that once I got home, I would be shower bound anyway. My practice basketball was tucked safely under my right arm, and I was too worn out from practice to even consider dribbling it in front of me as I walked. I couldn't have been more than a half a mile away from my doorstep when it happened. A van roared past me and slammed on its brakes just ahead. I froze, suddenly unsure of what was going on. Remembering this now is painful, because if I had just run as fast as I could have right then, my life probably would have been very different. But despite what I had been warned about the dangers of situations such as this one, my muscles were as solid as ice, and I just stared. A man in a dark coat and jeans jumped out of the now open side door and lunged at me. I finally got my body to respond, but it was much too late by that point. He had his hands on my shoulders and pulled me nearly off my feet as he dragged me back toward the van. I cried out, but his left arm wrapped around my thin frame, and his right hand shot up to cover my mouth. The basketball fell to the ground, splashing in a puddle and bouncing once, then twice. I still remember the flat sound of the basketball smacking the asphalt and water. It's funny what your brain chooses to pick out in times such as these. Before I could do anything else, I was inside the van. The panel door slid shut, and the man withdrew from me. Even then I could not see his face, nor would I for some time, but my cries were met with laughter from the man, as well as another man's voice coming from the driver's seat.
"Shut him up,"
was all the driver said. The man who had grabbed me stopped laughing, delivering a hard blow to the side of my head. I blacked out, and I don't remember anything else of the ride. I don't know how long it was before I woke up in the basement, but I can only assume that it wasn't too long. An hour, maybe. The room was very, very dark. So dark, in fact, that even after my eyes adjusted, I couldn't make out many details. I felt that the room was large and mostly empty, and as I splayed my palms out on the ground beneath me, I could tell that I was laying on top of some very old wooden plank flooring, the kind you find in many basements around the Seattle area. Splintery, slightly damp, and overly musty. Swiping a hand across those planks would result in grimy coating, not far from what you would get if you spent some time gardening. All around me was silence, so complete that it made the darkness seem even deeper. I could hear nothing, no matter how hard I strained my ears. I stood, and it was then that I noticed the heavy chain which was attached to my ankle. I quickly sat back down and ran my hands down my left leg. Sure enough, there was a thick steel ring there. It hung tightly to my flesh, so tightly that it nearly cut off the circulation. Welded onto the back of the ring was a heavy chain. I picked it up, feeling the cold links and trying to get a sense of dimension. I pulled on the chain. There was a bit of slack. I pulled it hand over hand for about 5 seconds before it went taut. I could feel that it was connected to the wall behind me. Standing and walking in the opposite direction, I seemed to have about 10 feet of slack at my disposal. My young mind began to panic at the situation. I was chained up in a very dark room, with no idea where I was or who had grabbed me. I didn't know if I was alone in the room, let alone if someone would be coming back to hurt me. Even at that age, I knew this was bad. Very bad. My mind recalled a story where a man had kidnapped a young girl, keeping her locked up and doing unspeakable things to her for years on end. before a neighbor rescued her. Was that to be my fate? I was alone in the room for hours before I got my answer. I tried calling out, crying, screaming, begging, none of which brought any additional information to my eyes or ears. The room remained dark and silent. That was until a blinding light illuminated the darkness. The light seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I screamed in fear, as well as pain. My eyes dilated all the way from the hours of darkness, recoiled at the white flash, and I dropped to my knees. It took a few moments for me to be able to squint, and when I did, I threw myself back into true fear. There was a staircase about 20 feet in front of me. The room was indeed empty, but I saw that the staircase led to a doorway. Standing in that doorway was a man, and I will never forget that face. It was pale, white, cold, and expressionless. His black hair was slicked straight back. His eyes were a deep shade of green, under which a green polo was tucked into a tattered pair of jeans. This was undoubtedly the man who had grabbed me off the street. Once he saw that I had seen him, he began to walk down the stairs towards me. His eyes never left me. He took each step individually, pausing for a second before taking the next one, clearly drawing out the tension of the moment. After about 30 seconds, he reached the bottom of the staircase. Now that he was closer, I could see that his skin was more than just pale. It was positively paper-like in color. I recalled seeing a documentary about severe diabetics before the advent of modern medicine. They would spend their short lives in bed, as they were sensitive to the sun's harsh glare, and their skin would take on a pallor such as this man bore. He drew closer to me with each step. The boots he wore would make a heavy clunk on the wooden planks, and a shiver would run through me. I kicked my heels against the floor and pushed myself back, immediately reverting to a child far younger than I was, as the fear of this man coursed through me. My back struck a brick wall behind me, and a whimper escaped my lips. "Hush, child. I'm not going to hurt you," the man said, but there was malice in his voice, and I didn't believe him. His eyes looked like someone who enjoyed hurting people. "Who are you?" was all I could manage. It came out as a very undignified squeak. "I am your new owner," the man replied, taking another step forward and smiling. "No, let me out of here," I cried, tears running down my cheeks and spilling off my face. I felt one make its way under my shirt and run down my chest, that warm rivulet sticking out to me for some reason, even as I stared into this man's horrible eyes. "I'm not going to do that," the man said, and even before he lunged at me, I knew that he had finished talking. He was on top of me before I knew what was happening, pinning me to the floor easily with his weight. The fear inside me became primal, and I tried to kick at him, but he parried my blows easily. He put one arm across my chest and used his legs to stop me from kicking any further. He actually laughed at my struggles. The man raised his other hand to me, and I could see that his pinky fingernail was long and sharp. The man drew his nail across my throat. Just a nick, but I could feel that it was deep. Blood welled out, and as I screamed, the man lowered his head to my neck and licked it off me. While that first night was horrible, it had nothing on what was to come. I would only see the man every couple of days, and only very briefly. When he next came down the stairs, I screamed and pushed myself flat against the wall, anticipating another attack. However, all he did was push a large bowl of what appeared to be oatmeal out toward me. When I didn't step forward to take it, he set it on the floor and backed away. Before turning and going up the stairs, he spoke one brief sentence. "Don't eat it all at once. That's all you'll be getting for a couple of days." The second attack came while I was sleeping. My belly was full of oatmeal and my face was soaking wet from tears. I cried so much in those first days. I cried for myself, as well as for my family, who were likely searching for me. I cried for my friends as well as for my future. Having decided that the man intended to keep me for as long as he could, but I also cried from fear. Fear of that first night, when the man straddled and cut me. And when I could cry no more, I slept. I awoke to the sound of the door at the top of the stairs opening. I jumped to my feet when I saw the man was already halfway down the stairs. He didn't have a bowl in his hands, and it wasn't my normal feeding time anyway. I knew then what was going to happen. I screamed. He didn't smile or laugh at me. He just lunged at me. I didn't touch the oatmeal at all for what must have been the better part of the day. My mind convinced me that it was drugged, and as soon as I ate it, I woke up with him on top of me, cutting me and licking up the blood once again. But eventually my hunger grew too strong, and I cautiously ate from the bowl. Though I still think of that gruel mostly as oatmeal, it most likely wasn't. It had the same texture and consistency, but it was somehow even blander than plain oatmeal. I ate a few handfuls before pushing the bowl away in disgust. It wasn't long, however, before I returned to the bowl. Over the course of a few hours, I had licked it clean. True to his word, the man did not return for another day. By then I was starving again, and since the room was barren, I had soiled an area of floor off to the left of my chain's place on the rear wall, as far away as I could get. I then withdrew to the opposite limit of my chain in disgust and embarrassment. The man returned an indistinguishable amount of time later. He replaced the bowl that I had basically polished clean with another full one. He then glanced at the mess I had made. "We'll have to get you a bucket for that, won't we?" he said, and left. Again, true to his word, the man brought a large bucket into the basement a couple of hours later, instructing me to use it for my waste. Afraid of what he would do to me if I didn't abide, I used the bucket. It was somewhere around 2 weeks later before he attacked me again. This became my life. The man would feed me a heaping bowl of oatmeal, or gruel, every 2 days. And every 2 weeks he would attack me, cutting me open and licking up the blood. The fear within me would well up, as I knew the time was approaching, and after it would happen, I felt a sense of relief, knowing that he wouldn't do it again for another 2 weeks. The passage of time seemed to accelerate, while still seeming to draw on forever when I was actually experiencing it. I took to sleeping as much as I could, since my waking hours were consumed with either eating, using my bucket, or waiting for the man to begin his next assault on my body. I knew in my head that he was sick. He had to be a sick, twisted man to chain up a young boy in his basement. But the lack of sexual perversion somehow scared me even more. Rather than being the type of kidnapper we had been warned about in schools, this man seemed to think that he was a vampire or something. He wasn't interested in me in any other way than keeping me alive until he would next consume my blood. I knew that, and it only made the experience worse, so I slept as much as I could. Eventually, even the attack stopped registering to me. I spent months at a time in a near catatonic state, realizing that it was easier simply to lie there and let it happen than to fight him. He seemed to realize that I had come to this conclusion, and after a while he wouldn't lunge at me in the same way. Instead, he would merely approach me and take what he needed. I never heard any sounds from the house above me. That struck me as odd. Adults were always having people over and doing things in their houses. I didn't even hear the sound of a television. The lights were kept on at all times. They were blindingly white fluorescent bulbs mounted high up in the basement ceiling, and they bathed my little world in a constant glow. Because of this eternal light and silence, other than the sounds of my chain clicking and dragging on the floor as I shuffled from side to side, I began to lose the line between my waking and sleeping hours. Dreams seemed to be real, and reality seemed to be a dream. I still don't know how many of the conversations I would eventually come to have with the man were real, but after what must have been years in that basement, he finally began to respond when I would hurl questions at him. These questions would mostly come from my delirium. I would vomit them out subconsciously as he stood before me. One exchange in particular stands out in my mind. He had just finished taking blood from my throat, and before he left, I spoke. "Why don't you just use a needle and take a bunch at once? Then you could just leave me alone." When he heard my question, he stopped at the base of the stairs and turned around before answering me. "Because then it wouldn't be fresh, and fresh is how I like it." I remember him tilting his head slightly, almost confused as to why he would even bother answering. "You're not a vampire. You know that, right?" I said, a slight chuckle in my voice. Just before this incident, I had a vivid dream about him cutting me just a little too deeply, causing me to bleed out on the floor. The thought hadn't been completely terrible. "You're right, of course. We're not vampires. We're far better than that," the man said. No humor in his voice whatsoever. He then turned and walked back up the stairs. My escape was not something that I planned much in advance. It happened quickly, almost before I even knew what I was doing. It was not the carefully orchestrated master plan you were probably hoping for. Years had passed since that first night, and I had grown significantly. The manacle on my ankle, which had been pretty tight before, was now becoming so tight that my foot was beginning to turn purple. The man saw this as he brought me my meal, and commented that he needed to adjust it. After he left, the full impact of what he had said registered to only my half-awake mind. Suddenly I became alive, really alive, and was more attentive than I had been in a long time. He left to get what he needed to adjust the manacle on my foot. This meant that he was going to take it off of me. I would have a single chance. I ate my oatmeal quickly, wanting to build as much strength as I could muster. The man returned a couple of hours later. I had already laid on the ground. I acted as if I was in my normal state, somewhere between reality and the dream world, letting him do whatever it was he wanted to do. I kept my eyes closed as I heard his boots come down the stairs and then across the wooden planks. "Stay just like that. I'm going to fix your shackle, and then I'll take blood." His voice was very near. I could tell that he was standing above me. Without another word, he crouched, and I felt his hands on my foot. It tingled, having gone somewhat numb due to the lack of circulation. I heard keys being rustled, and then I felt the manacle click open. I almost shuddered in disbelief. That metal ring had been on my ankle for years. The fright came over me again, knowing that I had mere moments to act. I almost froze, as I had on that night so long ago. I almost couldn't do it, but then I remembered where I was, and what I had become. How many times I had wished he would just kill me. I knew that it was far more likely that he would easily overpower me, but I had to take that chance. I snapped my eyes open and kicked him as hard as I could. The blow connected with the side of his head. He reeled back as a cry escaped his lips. I jumped up and nearly fell down again, my foot becoming hypersensitive as blood rushed back into it. I saw that he had a new manacle on the ground, next to where I had been laying. I stooped and grabbed it, jumping on the man before he could regain his senses. I held the ring in my hand tightly, and I brought it down on his forehead with all my might. His skin split, and blood poured down across his face. He cried out, but I brought it down again and again. I beat the ring into the man's skull as hard as I could, pummeling his face into a mess of ragged flesh and exposed bone. He shuddered and went still. Tears streamed down my face, and I threw the ring down. I sat on the man's chest, with my own heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Finally, I stood, looking down at the man's body. He was unrecognizable. I screamed at his body, rage still flowing through me. After some time, I realized that I had to go. I had to get out of that basement. I moved away from the man's limp form and began to walk towards the stairs. Just as I mounted the first step, I heard a sudden movement behind me. I turned to see the man was not dead. He had turned over and was dragging his body across the floor toward me. His face, still a mess of gore, was turned up toward me. He bellowed, blood spewing from his lips. I stared in horror as he used his arms to pull himself across those wooden planks, leaving a small trail of red ooze in his wake. I stumbled backwards, falling on the stairs and pushing myself up. The man pushed himself up, and to my horror, I could see that as the blood streamed down his face, his wounds were beginning to heal. The gashes I had made on his forehead, cheeks, jaw, and skull were slowly stitching themselves back together, closing and sealing themselves shut. Already those piercing, deep green eyes were clear again, and he stared at me. The man tried to regain his feet, but stumbled and fell again. I managed to get myself up several more steps, as I tried to get away while simultaneously shocked into disbelief at what I saw before me. Agonizingly slow, the man did manage to get to his feet. He looked at me, and while his face was torn and bloody, he was nowhere near as bad as he had been when I had finished with him. It was the first step he took toward me which finally got me to my senses. I screamed, got to my feet, and ran up the stairs as fast as I could. He threw himself after me, falling against the stairs and pulling himself upward. Horrible growls and screams came from him, becoming more human-sounding with each breath. Finally, I reached the top of the staircase and hurled myself through the door. I slammed it shut. That's when I saw that there were 2 deadbolts. I rammed both of them into the locked position. I stood there for a moment, staring at the other side of the door, though I was terrified of the horror within. I was still dumbfounded at finally being out of the basement. I was snapped out of my trance when a loud thud came from the other side of the door, shaking its frame. He was there, separated from me by mere inches of wood, and was pounding his fists against the frame. I turned and ran. It took me a while to find my way out of the house, and those moments were some of the worst I experienced throughout the entire ordeal. He pounded and pounded on the door, screaming incoherently the whole time. As I finally came to the front of the house, I heard the splintering of wood, and I knew that he had managed to get through at last. I turned outside, and to my great shock, it was daytime. I hadn't seen the outdoors, let alone the sunshine, in what must have been a decade. Knowing that the man would be making his way through the house, I managed to keep my head about me and hobbled down the driveway. My foot was really beginning to hurt at this point. It had spent weeks without proper circulation, and I was no longer capable of a full run. The sounds of the man's horrible, furious anger suddenly became clear, and I turned to see him coming through the front doorway. His wounds were now completely gone, and his eyes were positively burning with fury. His face had taken on strange features, the bones of his brow becoming more pronounced, and the bridge of his nose was now widened and elongated. He looked like a wild animal. I screamed again, my throat becoming sore, and I quickened my step. But I knew that I didn't have the strength to escape him. He would catch me and pull me back inside. For some reason, though, he stopped at the end of the porch. He stood there, seething with rage, but he would come no further. His face was in shadow, but I still remember those green eyes staring at me as his chest heaved. I hobbled, step by agonizing step. I got away. I made my way away from the man's house. It was in a remote area, with no other buildings anywhere nearby. It took me more than an hour to make it to the main road. I collapsed several times, and even resorted to dragging myself along the ground more than once. At long last, I made it to the end of the man's long dirt driveway, and began to walk down the highway. After another few hours, an SUV pulled up alongside me. I was delirious with exhaustion, and I only have the faintest memory of collapsing into an officer's arms. For the second time in my life, I awoke in a place that I had never been, in the presence of a man I had never seen. I will admit to screaming in terror when I saw him, my mind immediately thinking that I was back in the basement. But when that panic faded, I saw that the man was a doctor, and that I was lying on a hospital bed. The doctor explained that I had been found on the side of the road, stumbling, and on the verge of collapse. I panicked again when I realized that I was restrained in the bed, but the doctor explained that I had been strapped there for my own safety, as I had been raving and throwing myself about in my delirium, screaming about monsters. It's been about a year since my escape. I spent weeks going over my story with police, reporters, and eventually psychiatrists. While the investigating officers did find the house, along with the basement and chain, as I described, they never found the man. In fact, they found no trace of him at all. There wasn't even furniture in the house. It was completely empty. Though they have tried to convince me that the last part of my ordeal, the man's sudden resurrection, and the healing of his wounds, was just a psychotic break brought on by the stress I endured, I don't believe it. I know what I saw, and I know what happened. He is still out there. But that's not what terrifies me the most. What keeps me up at night was the response he gave after I told him that he wasn't a vampire. We're not vampires. We're far better than that.
There's always a reason to be afraid.